Greetings. Welcome to the DragonCon Urban Fantasy Track author interview series. And this evening, I am joined by the wonderful Leanna Renee Hieber, longtime supporter of the track and friend of mine. And it's a delight to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this, especially at such a busy time for you.
Well,
really
you know, I would do anything for you and the Urban Fantasy Track, Carol. So my DragonCon family is the best. So anything for you guys, and I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, it sure is a busy time, but all the more exciting to be able to talk about these books right in their release weeks.
That's right. We have a lot of things to cover because any of your current readers, people who've been reading you all along, will enjoy hearing a little bit about your earlier stuff. And then we will be talking about the new things too, so that people who maybe just discovered you, will also hear about the older things. So, we'll keep it fun for everyone, I hope. Now,
you.
the first question I always ask everyone is, did you read fantasy or science fiction as a child?
Absolutely. In fact, the earliest book that I really remember reading and really taking to heart was actually a book just called Haunted Houses. And it was a book of ghost stories. And some were sort of fabricated and others were taken from real legitimate accounts. And it was done like a children's chapter book that would have been sold like in the Scholastic Book Fair. It's just this tattered old paperback that had a bunch of watercolor pictures in it. And I was just entranced by this. So it was definitely for young readers. And that went with me everywhere. And from that point on, I was really interested in ghosts. And that factored into all the things I was drawn to were all in line with the paranormal. So, or with fantasy. I mean, of course, I imprinted early on Lord of the Rings, of course. And Madeline Allengel's Wrinkle in Time was a huge, huge influence for me. And then I kind of went right from that into some Stephen King, who remains, an influence to this day for me. But of course, my great love is Edgar Allan Poe. When I first had a collection of his poetry and short stories, that was everything to me. I was very drawn to the Victorian aesthetic. I was very drawn to historical ghost stories that centered around the 19th century in a way that I've described definitely on panels with you as sort of a past life kind of thing, drawn to an era in an inexplicable way that I really couldn't quite pin down. It seemed like it was a bond that surpassed the mere mortal coil in these modern centuries. So that's really propelled me forward as an interest in historical fantasy specifically, both reading historical texts, but then also what is my interpretation as a modern person of these historic texts, especially if they deal with the paranormal, which can almost sometimes be a way to make something contemporaneous, sort of a bit of time travel in and of itself. So that's kind of been my draw all my life. And I just keep going back to the things that first made me excited when I was young, because I think in some ways, if you're not to always go back to the same source material, but not to always be drawing from the same well, but drawing from the things that made you passionate as a reader and a writer early on is like tapping into that sort of that purity of love for any project that you're doing.
Right. And I can see that it would be, there's a source of rejuvenation, but also comfort at the same time, right? Going back to those same things, or those same types of things, those same feelings anyway, even if they're not exactly the same item. So now some of your longtime readers may know this, but some people who just came upon you recently may not realize that your very first published work was actually science fiction. And yes, and what I'm curious about is how did I'm kind of curious how that ended up being what happened first. Now, you notice I said published because I know that that's not always the way it works with the actual writing process. But I'm kind of curious about how that came about, and then how you then made the move into what we consider the more the Leanna zone now.
Absolutely, it is. And this is honestly just a trick of the publishing genre. Just the publishing industry, frankly.
Right.
So I was querying and working on my debut novel. My debut full-length novel is historical fantasy, and that's my Strangely Beautiful series, which is back in print now in new revised editions, thanks to Tor Books. And I was querying and working on the. Oh, look at you with a visual aid. Bless you, Carol.
Yes.
I can always count on you. Thank you for that. Yeah, so those are my babies, but those are my first full-length works, and those took a long way to get from the querying process to my first agent to my first publication. And then even longer still to get to the editions they live in today. So while I was in that process, and the process of my first debut novel took about 9 years, and I wasn't querying full-time through that whole time. I was actually trying to be a professional actress at the time, and I was working for Shakespeare companies, and I was working in the regional theater circuit doing professional theater from Ohio to Minnesota to Florida and back again, working on predominantly classical theater, 19th century classical theater to be specific. And of course, on brand. I always liked to be in the costumes. So my first great love, of course, were these Strangely Beautiful characters, but I also was friends with and connected with a whole bunch of writers because I knew that I wanted to go into writing. I knew I wanted to be a published author. And so Isabeau Kelly, the author, she's a lovely, fantastic author. She writes under many different names. Kat Simmons is what she's publishing under now. But Isabeau Kelly, dear friend of mine, my first writer friend in New York City when I moved there, she dared me. She goes, "You love Star Trek so much, and you love futuristic things. You love science fiction. You love space opera, basically. Why don't you write? What would be your take on, a science fiction story, a space opera story? You love, the character of Deanna Troi. That was always she was always my favorite in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So I was always really interested in psychic phenomena in that kind of environment. So it really was a dare. She said, "I dare you. You are so focused on only doing historical fantasy. I absolutely dare you." She triple dog dared me to write.
Triple, yeah.
I mean, it was really out there. She was throwing down, and I triple dog dare you to write a space opera novella, so a shorter piece. Novellas usually around 35,000 words. And she said, and I'll even sweeten the pot in that I am working with a small press. And I think I can get it published if you let me run it by our editorial staff, and I will volunteer to be your editor. And I thought, okay, well, I needed my foot in the door, and for a lot of professional writers, working with a small press starting out is a great way to get your foot in the door. And sometimes those small presses do not stay around. This one did not. It was not long for this world. However, it was a very professional. It was a very professional process. And I was paid for this novella, and it came out in 2008, and that was called Dark Nest, and it won a Prism Award. So I became an award-winning author right away, which was very exciting and very affirming. In some ways, I think starting out with something that was done on a bit of a dare, albeit it was full of love, and I love that novella, and I've since come back to that universe and written more in that universe since then, and it was very well received. In some ways, doing that kind of got me out of my own head, thinking, okay, maybe I only do this one thing. And I think every author should be challenged by their colleagues to write something they didn't think they could do. And then I still had all these other things and all these other projects that I loved. And Strangely Beautiful, I knew was a thing that I had, if nothing else, I had to get that published. My absolute babies, they had to live in the world. And that's actually when I made the transition from being a full-time actress to being a full-time novelist, was when I was at a Broadway callback, and all I could think about was my Strangely Beautiful babies. I say babies just because those characters are particularly close to me. So I think I had to be at that level where I was actually at a Broadway callback, and I really was thinking about this other thing being my books. And I was like, okay, I think I need to go and pursue that, because everyone else at that Broadway callback was only thinking about getting that role. And I was daydreaming about something else. And I was like, I think that's a sign. I need to kind of step back from the audition circuit and shift into trying to network within publishing and learn and focus on my writing craft. So that was the shift for, sort of full-time novelist, always with some side hustles, that's
Right,
that's
right.
definitely been a part of it. I never left theater. I still do performance as one of my side hustles, which is kind of fun. So
Well, yeah, I mean, I can certainly understand why you would want to do that. I mean, that's in your blood too.
it
So
is.
it's just not taking up quite as much room in the arteries as the writing, right?
Yeah, now I pursue professional theater projects that come to me or that I can orchestrate on my own, one-woman shows, things like that, things that don't require me to be out on the audition circuit as often as it was, because then that's what was eating up my time away from writing was the auditioning process. So now I just work with people I've worked with before who know me and know my credits and know my resume and know my style, things I like to do, or I'm making my own opportunities in between book contracts.
Gotcha. Now, I held it up once before, and we've mentioned Strangely Beautiful, so I'm going to do that again. And yes, this is the preferred edition.
It is.
And what I'm going to ask is that just in case people who are watching this interview have not read that series, give us maybe your elevator pitch for Strangely Beautiful. Tell us what it's about.
Okay. The quickest way to do this is to tell you it is Victorian Ghostbusters with Greek mythology bleeding onto the streets, literally, in 1888 at the time of Jack the Ripper. So what I'm doing is I'm infusing some mythological underpinnings into a gas lamp fantasy setting. So gas lamp fantasy, that genre term, refers to fantasy settings that is in a gaslit era. So the time of the Victorian street lamps, that's what it's trying to evoke in that particular genre tag. So Victorian Ghostbusters with a very sweet romance. So it's sort of like if you were taking Jane Eyre, but mixing it with a good old Victorian ghost story. So I was interested in the setting and the real gothic feel of Jane Eyre, but absolutely infusing it with a very, very ghost-filled environment. So, and people will definitely see the parallels between the hero and the heroine in Jane Eyre to my Percy and Alexi. So and it follows the rest of the quartet. So there's 2 novels that go into the Strangely Beautiful omnibus. Then the prequel is Perilous Prophecy, and the finale is Miss Violet and the Great War. And so it follows the family of these Ghostbusters as they discover both their sort of trajectory, their prophecy, and then into sort of their family legacy. So it's 2 books set in 1888, a prequel set in 1867, and then the finale into World War I, which is a harrowing. That was the most harrowing research I've ever done. But that series is so very dear to me. So that series is now complete.
Okay. Yes, Miss Violet in the Great War. So yes, that's a great title too. All right. So now we have kind of the basis there for what, for your first series, even though, as you were saying, the at least the 4th one was written much later, was just in the last few years, right? So.
Right. Because the reason why there's second editions is that my first publisher was a publisher called Dorchester, and they closed their doors and went bankrupt, and that was very difficult for all of us. But we got our rights back after a bit of a struggle, and then Tor Books republished them, and then published Miss Violet, which was always scheduled to be published. But I had never completed it because that bankruptcy went through, and I went on to other projects because that was in limbo, and I was like, okay, all right, I guess we'll come back to that when it has a life again and a house again. So coming back to that 10 years later was a wild experience, but I still had all my research and my very, very visceral memories of traveling to France with my family, and we were just so stunned by Verdun in particular, and so a lot of the story takes place there. So it's been a joy to get to go back and finish all the loose ends. A lot of times in publishing, then this I'm not the only person. This happens all the time. If you've been in the publishing game for a while, houses close, editors leave, there's radical changes. Ebooks were just becoming a thing when I was just getting started. Chains of bookstores closing, distribution things changing, everything's changing, and it continues to change, and platforms for distribution of content. So I was just glad to be able to go back to that book, and then by that point I had other characters from another series I could bring in and sort of weave the Heberverse together. So all of my characters, it's true, all my characters are crossover characters from one series to the next. You don't have to have read one of my series to start at the beginning of another one, but you will recognize familiar characters.
It's kind of like it's a good it's not really an in joke, but it's a fun thing for someone who has read the previous series to say, oh, there they are. Yes. That's a fun part.
Good. That's what I hope. We always want to make sure, because these have been, all of my books have been, my series are with a bunch of different publishers. So I've always gotten the okay from my editors to bring in characters. I retain all the rights to my characters, and to be able to take them with me from one place or one house to the next. I just have to make sure that I'm not putting too much insider information that would be required from another series. So it still has to be pertinent. If I'm bringing in a character, it has to be pertinent to this particular series, and make sure that I'm not putting in too much backstory. There's always going to be, you're always meeting characters sort of in the middle of something. So there's going to be a little bit of backstory that you're going to need to know. And I try to loop that in as I go. But that's one of the conversations I always have with my editors, is how much of this do I need to pull from what previously happened, and how much can I just let this be an extant character who has a history of ghost busting, or being a psychic detective, or having psychometric abilities, things like that. So it's been fun to kind of uncover that from one place to the next, and continue to get to know my characters.
Right. And I'm sure that I know as a reader, it's fun to, when they pop up, whether it's just in passing, or if it's in if they play a little bigger role within the stories. And I'm sure it's fun for you to get to do that as well. And even though, as you say, you have to kind of ride the line to make sure you're not doing too much.
Yep, absolutely.
Now the next series that you came out with was The Magic Most Foul, that was written as a YA series, and but with a very unique premise, and very interesting, I might add. And tell people about this series. This is the first book, Darker Still.
Yes,
I've got the other ones, but it would be hard to hold all three of them.
That is very fair. I love this series.
So what's your elevator pitch for this one?
All right. So it is a paranormal mystery set in 1880 New York City, dealing with a haunted painting and a demonic cabal behind it. So it has a central romance, a knight in shining distress, and the damsel in shining armor has to go and save him. So I was interested in inverting, like, the girl has to save the guy, and she's not equipped with much. She really is. No one around her is really able to understand what's going on, except for one sort of maternal character who helps see her through. And I was very inspired by The Picture of Dorian Gray for this one. It's one of my favorite books by Oscar Wilde. But in that book, spoilers, the love interest kills herself. And that always unsettled me. So I wanted to write a romance where the lady lives and thrives. So I took on that, but I still kept the haunted painting premise. And I wrote in an epistolary style, in the manner of Dracula, one of my very favorite texts. So it's written, and by epistolary style, I mean it's written in diary entries and letters.
Yes, and lots of fun. And I got to tell you, I really like that title too. I think that's I think the title is very apt for the book. or yeah, for this one for
That
sure.
one went rounds. That was Sourcebooks, my editor at Leah Holtenschmidt, my editor at Sourcebooks. Her and I went rounds and rounds and rounds trying to figure out that title. That's the most changed title of any book I've ever written. Darker Still went through 30 different titles before we settled on Darker Still. And it was definitely a title by committee. So some folks don't know this, but if you're traditionally published, you don't get the say over your covers or your titles. The interior of the book, the actual book itself, that's very much in your hands. But the titling and the covers, that's the work of the marketing team and the publisher. So, and so I've been lucky in that I've gotten great titles and great covers. But sometimes it's been a big discussion, and I'm not necessarily great about titling my things. So I've been grateful for the help.
Yeah, well, that one I think is perfect, and it's just a gorgeous cover.
It's so pretty.
It really,
it's so pretty.
It really is. Now, your next series, you got the Eterna Files,
and this is a career retrospective. This is amazing.
It is. Yes.
I love this.
And so, what can you tell us about? Because all I got to say is, unless somebody is brand new to your writing, if they have not read this series yet, shame on them. But anyway, I'm kidding.
Bless you. Bless you. That one is the easiest for me to blurb, even though it has the largest cast of characters and is frankly my by far most complex of any of my series. But it's the easiest to pitch. It's Victorian X-Files.
There you go. Yeah.
That's pretty much that. I really throw just about every single paranormal aspect, trope, quality, talent, anything paranormal. It's all fair game. It's all in there. So plus my Strange and Beautiful characters, they show up too. So,
right.
About every character I've ever written is in there just about one way or another. And it all deals with an international cabal of demonic forces that made their first appearance in the Magic Most Foul series. So I just up the ante, because the Darker Still and the Magic Most Foul books were young adult. So it's a smaller cast of characters focusing just on teenagers. For the Eterna Files, I'm taking that sort of, this cabal has gotten even worse and even uglier. And it's an adult set of characters, a very large cast of characters in a dual timeline in London and New York. So there's two sort of X-Files type offices, one in London, one in New York in the 1880s. And they're all trying to figure out what is going on in this particular international cabal that is creating supernatural problems for both countries. So
I like that, supernatural problems. Yes, indeed. Now, and I've got to say, the premise behind this in the beginning, it was very unique, and it will capture people right away. So anybody watching this, if you haven't read that series yet, get on it. Okay. Now, next up, we have the Spectral City series. And this is the first volume, which is Spectral City. And what can you tell our viewers about this series?
Oh, I love this one. So the Spectral City series is psychic detectives and their favorite friendly ghosts who solve crime in 1899 Manhattan with the help of a dashing detective and definitely help from the spirit world. So it's more of a paranormal procedural, and I wrote it much more in the vein of a mystery. However, because it is a trilogy, it has a fantasy arc in that it is a 3-part mystery. So mystery readers, do not be alarmed that not the whole of the mystery is not solved in book 1. One part of a 3-part mystery is solved in book 1. So it has a bit of a fantasy structure, but with a bit of mystery clothing. So all of my books are very cross genre. They have mystery, paranormal, romance elements, some horror elements for certain as well, and young adult crossover, because I do have that young adult series and everything's written under my name. And I want folks who pick up my young adult series to be able to also pick up my adult series and it not be a drastic content jump. So everything I keep in the range of PG-13 in terms of like sort of content quality. I think that works best with my style, which is sort of a classical Victorian style. So I really feel in that regard that, that helps keep a semblance, especially since these are crossover characters. This is not a drastic difference in tone, really, just in focus, and the character focus is much different from one to the next. So my Spectral series focuses on a group of psychic detectives that are women, young women, and then their allies within the police department at a time when there was certainly some prejudice going around. So the characters who are marginalized really stick up for each other. I really love the idea of found family narratives, people who would be marginalized in society one way or another, finding strength in each other, and finding ways around restrictive societal norms. And the paranormal is how I do that. I use the paranormal as a way to empower my characters in a time when they wouldn't either be believed or they wouldn't have rights. So I'm trying to work within that at a time when people are starting, we as a society, we're really starting to look at things like civil rights, workers' rights, suffrage, universal suffrage, things like that. So it's a very dynamic time to set something in. I don't romanticize the era at all. I have characters fighting for a modern, a better future because people were doing that at that point.
Yes, the historical accuracy, even in in a paranormal with paranormal trappings, if you want to call it that, or focus plot, however you want to describe it, you still want that historical accuracy if you want if you want to suspend disbelief. So I think you do a great job of it, and I know it can't be easy to to pull that out every single time.
Well, it is my job. I am a New York City tour guide, and so you do have to get a license and pass a test to be able to be a New York City tour guide. And so I do not want my credibility as a New York City tour guide to be questioned by historical inaccuracies. So it's been a wonderful job to have on the side between contracts, and how many tours I give. It really depends on my schedule with my publishing and how many books on contract I have. But I've loved doing that because it really allows me to walk in the places and the steps my characters are walking. And I'm a very atmospheric writer. And so I really want to try to lead my readers through the streets of historic New York, like I try to do in my tours. So.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And now your book that just came out, I don't have a physical copy of to show, but I know you
I
do.
do.
The Ghosts of the Forbidden, and that it's great. It's a lot of fun. It's a very different take for you in two ways, because it's got a contemporary setting for the main story anyway, and then you also your take on ghosts in this one is somewhat different, I think, than it has been in the past. And so
Mm-hmm.
I what can you tell folks about this? And happy book birthday yesterday.
Thank you. Yes. So Ghosts of the Forbidden, it's brand new. And this is an exception in that this book is not in the Hieber verse, because this is a new universe created by Castlebridge Media, and I am just writing in it. Now, granted, being the first in this series, the first to write in this world, I really got free reign to create a lot of it. And I have a
Right.
wonderful partnership with Castlebridge Media doing this. It's just an absolutely fantastic, company to work with. I've really, really enjoyed them. And so with this series, it's set in a fictional Colorado town called Glazier's Gap. And a glazier is traditionally was someone who was working with mirrors. And usually that was in the historical periods, that was silver. So it is a old silver mining town where the mine is now presently in contemporary setting defunct. But I'm very much playing with the trope of reincarnation. So as my books are, save for this one, this is my first contemporary set book, but the characters and the ghosts and the reincarnations of the current characters, they are reincarnate from the Victorian era. So they're realizing that they're having these memories that are not theirs, not in this body, but their souls are being given a second chance. So it's sort of a second chance lover's story. It's very much a romance. It's a Gothic romance, so it's very much, it has a very romantic through line, but I'm doing it kind of unconventionally in that the actual physical embodiment of the hero doesn't show up until about halfway through the book. It's just the ghost who's kind of trying to bid the heroine to remember who she used to be when she was in the small town before. So it very much follows the Gothic premise of young woman arrives at spooky new place and has to uncover the mysteries therein. So I'm very much pulling from Dark Shadows. I always loved that show. And very much pulling from the concept of looking at a painting and it looking like the characters and realizing that there's something strange going on. So I'm dealing with ghosts. I'm dealing with sort of a demonic presence. There's an exorcism. There's lots of women running from houses, as you can see in the interior. Yeah, we've had a hashtag going of women running from houses. This is very much modeled in the style of a 1970s Gothic. So the 70s and 80s, when you had these women running from houses books where there was always a manor in the background, always some atmospheric fog or something, and a woman looking back and running away. So we created, well, I didn't create, but the fine folks at Castlebridge Media in Churlyo specifically, our incredible designer, created a step back cover. So this says Martha Green's The Curse, from the author of River of Blood, The Curse. This is the book within a book. So my heroine, when she comes to Glazier's Gap, Colorado, she's realizing that she's falling into the plot of a Gothic novel. So it's very metatextual in that way. She's a goth like me in a Gothic novel, and she's aware of the trappings. And then she's sort of having to realize that she now has to find her way through this and out of that while she is actually a character in The Curse.
Yeah.
So it was really fun because there's a quote here, and it's something that I had put into the manuscript, saying, "We make ghosts out of every joy and sorrow if we leave any of them unsaid." And that had been the inscription that I had written in the book that Lillian is reading, and I was just very, very pleased. It's always nice when your designer reads the book.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a detail on there, so that was pretty fun. So it's a category length. So this is not a long book. I was specifically given the direction for, okay, we want a Gothic romance. It's going to be contemporary, but it has to have paranormal elements. You have a lot of free reign, so come up with a pitch. Let us know what you're thinking. And I was like, can I do reincarnate Victorian ghost lovers? And they're like, yes. I said, then I'm in, because I didn't trust myself to do it contemporary if it didn't have some kind of Victorian tie-in. It's like my gateway drug to writing in the contemporary setting.
That's
right?
There you go.
Right. So with that, they said, yeah, category length, you've got a word count limit. So 50,000 words was my limit. So we're keeping these sort of short and sweet, and hopefully the book will do well so we can continue the series. It's with a small press, so we're kind of trying things out, doing some experimenting, and seeing where it goes.
Now, do they have a set number of other volumes in that same, with the same theme or the same ideas? Do they have? They definitely
want to. They definitely want to continue in this series. The concept being that everything would be set in a small town and everything would have a different paranormal romance at the core of it. So there would be crossover characters from one to the next. I definitely have a vision of 2 more specifically in this series, but then they're interested in having other writers work in this world as well. So this would not necessarily be a world that would just be mine. So I certainly am happy to help flesh out some of this setting, and then at some other point have other authors writing in this sort of shared universe, as it were. So we'll see how all of that goes. There's a lot of experimenting that we're doing here. So it was fun to try something different. Folks have asked me, would you ever write a contemporary? I said, well, if I'm approached to write one, sure. I don't know that I would do it if I weren't encouraged to do it.
Right.
And
yeah.
I did have to run it by some readers, some of my beta readers, to be like, hi guys, does this read at all remotely like a modern person talking? Because, my voice is very historic and it is very comfortable in the 19th century. And so I really had to kind of put a different mindset in on this one. So, but yeah, so hopefully we'll get to do more.
Yeah, well, I hope so. It's a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we're getting to have the conversation about it during release week.
Yay!
So that's very exciting. And I do want to mention, just in passing, before we get out of the fiction, that you have done some short stories for different anthologies, the Castle of Horror and things like that. And I know that short stories can be their own set of challenges, and you have experience with novels, novellas, and short stories, and certainly people can find those. It's mostly the Castle of Horror anthologies, and there has been something else.
I've been doing novellas, a series of different novellas for a company called Scribed. So if you go onto scribd.com, you can find several series of novellas that I've done that tie into my other work. So the Dark Nest universe that you mentioned can be found on Scribed, and I narrate the audiobooks. So my professional acting background comes into play as I get to narrate my own fiction. So that's been very exciting. And all of those are novellas. I have two sets there. One is the that goes along with Dark Nest. So there's the Dark Nest trilogy. There's the Time Immemorial trilogy, which pulls in characters from Dark Nest and from Eterna files. So pulls those in. And then also I have the Spirit Suitor novellas, which carries on Spectral City characters and gives them their own romance. So I have a very rambunctious ghost named Maggie and a very charming exorcist named Reverend Coronado. And they're two side characters in the Spectral City series. And so when I was approached by Scribed to do original content for them, I said, I've got this sort of spin-off series. Can I pitch this? And they loved the idea. So a love story between a ghost and an exorcist. It was a lot of fun to write. And Maggie had threatened to run away with my last Spectral City book. So I really needed to give her her own novella for everyone's sake. So she's such a character, because she's been with me since the Magic Most Foul books. That character was one of the mean girls in that original young adult series, and she really just never went away. She corporeally she went away, but her spirit lived on, and is still causing trouble, but like in a good way now. She was mean before, but she has a redemptive arc through the Spirit Suitor books, which has been really fun. So those novellas are inscribed, and if you don't have a subscription to Scribed, there's a free 30-day trial that you can do. So it's been very, very fun to be writing, knowing that I would also get a chance to read the audio and narrate the audiobooks. That's been a blast.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Well, talking about Maggie is actually a good segue into my next question. And that is, do you have a favorite secondary or maybe recurring character out of your series that if you had to pick one or two, who have been the most fun to write?
Oh my God. See, it's really is like picking children. You're not supposed to have a favorite, but in terms of secondary character, it really would have to be Maggie, because she just was such a force of nature through my series and just kept coming back one way or another. And it just sort of surprised me. And I just get such a kick out of her. Her voice has always been so clear to me. In terms of heroines, that's really hard. Like if I was trying to pick main characters, that's impossible, because they're all sort of bits of me. But there is something to be said for, my first characters. There's something about Miss Percy Parker that will always be like my darling girl. And there's something in everything that I do that I have a great love for. So that's really, really tough, because I think I'll think about one thing and then I'll think about something else and say, no, it's gotta be this one, But and I think that speaks to having a volume of work, loving all of them. It being hard to pick is kind of a good thing. There's definitely characters that are more like me than others. Clara Templeton is very much sort of pieces of me that go into the Eterna series, and Eve Whitby in Spectral City. There's aspects of her that very much tie into my personality, but there's nothing that's a direct insert for me. But I am a goth, and then Lillian Lillian Anders is goth in here, and so a lot of her worldview ties into my worldview. Her favorite bands are my favorite bands, things like
Oh,
that.
there you
Because
go. Yeah.
I thought, I was like, all right, if I have to do contemporary, I'm going to have to base it on something. So I'm going to base it on me, and she'll be a little bit of a weirdo like me, and she'll have fun with this setting, and and in some ways, her being a goth, interested in spooky things, makes her a little bit more aware of the situation that she's in, and can kind of deal with it a little bit more. Like, I am as a ghost tour guide. When something actually paranormal happens, I'm like, yeah, no, it's part of the job.
No surprise.
No, not really.
As you said, just part of the job. Well, now you mentioned both Clara and Eve, and as though they are, a couple of the main characters from your more recent series, anyway. And how would you say that those two characters are most alike, and how are they most different?
Eve has a real sense of her purpose right away in life. She's 19 going on 50 in terms of she's a very mature character who knows right early on in her life that she's meant to be a psychic medium. There's no other path for her. The spirits will have it no other way. And so she's had to grow up quickly because she's been absolutely dogged by the spirit world. And so her path was very clear. Clara had to kind of find herself. And there's much more of exploratory journey for Clara. So by the time we see Clara again in the Spectral City series, because Clara first shows up in Eterna Files, and we're actually at the end of Magic Most Foul. I tie her in. So she shows up at the end of Magic Most Foul to get us ready for Eterna Files. And then she comes when she is in the Spectral City series. Clara has gotten completely solid in herself and her path, and she's a force of nature by the time we meet her in the Spectral City series. In fact, Eve is quite daunted by her. She's an energy worker, and she's absolutely fierce, and she could kind of shut down an electrical grid if she really wanted to.
Not something they wanted to deal with back then,
No, really, not so much. No. So she sort of becomes a paranormal force of nature in her own right by the end of by the end of Eterna. So yeah, I think that in some ways, being settled in their path. We're all, as people, we're all works in progress. So they're just works in progress at different points in time. For Clara, it's a matter of trusting herself. For Eve, it's actually a matter of trusting everyone around her.
Yeah, I can see that, especially since she has to deal with the people that she works with who are, alive, and then the ones the ones she works with who are not.
Yeah, a lot of unreliable narrators in the, and she's like, I know you all are trying to help, but we actually have to have corporeal evidence to give to the jury because I cannot call you, my dear spirits, to the stand.
Yes, that would be quite a challenge. Now, what would you say out of these 4 different series of yours? What would you say was probably the most dangerous, or the most dangerous antagonist or foe that your characters had to face?
Oh, that's such a good question. The most dangerous foe. It's got to be Moriel and the Magic Most Foul, the Masters Society in both my young adult and in Eterna Files. The Masters Society is really nasty. They really just want to go back to feudalism and have everybody kind of as in a servant class, beholden to their particular brand of lording over people. And it's really, they think this whole industrial revolution and the creation of the middle class, they think all of this is a bad idea, and they just want to take people back into the haves and the have-nots in a way that's like beyond what was historically true, into something much, much worse. So I think that their just absolutely warped worldview is extremely dangerous. I think in Spectral City, my villains are sometimes just misguided people. And so it's not that there's not stakes there. It's not that there's not danger there. There really is. But I think, they're a little bit more humanized in that regard. It's not quite as large the Shakespearean villain that I've created in the Master Society cabal, that literally demonic cabal. And when you're messing with demons, it's always like, it's always really bad news. So I would have to say them. Even though I'm dealing with something, you know, a sort of a Greek mythological force of darkness in Strange and Beautiful, that one to me felt like I could get my head around a lot more than like trying to get into the minds of the Master Society villains, plural villains. It's an ugly place.
Yeah, I agreed. Now, I know that they are all like your children, but do you have like favorite installments out of each of the series, or is there one book that stands out to you that's really been your favorite? Whether it was the experience of writing it, whether it was the final product, or just something that's close to your heart for whatever reason, more so than maybe the others.
That's another great question. It's interesting because it's bookended, because I will always have this absolute rhapsodic place in my heart for Strangely Beautiful. Those first two books, they're so special to me. There's nothing like your first novel. There really isn't. Plus, it went through 22 revisions, so I was with it for the longest out of any of my books. You know, so it lived with me for a really long time. It was a bit before it reached its final form. And there's just something about that will always just hold my heart. And then probably I also believe that this is my tightest, probably most efficient novel, is my third Spectral City book, A Summoning of Souls. In A Summoning of Souls, it's actually my best reviewed book. I got like a publisher's weekly review that was like, Hieber is firing on all cylinders. And I was like, yes. So, you know, I felt like it was just clean. It knew what it needed to be. It knew where it needed to go. I was able to layer in some of my own personal inspirations and some of my own personal things that I felt like I wanted to say, that I felt like the spirit world wanted me to say, because I am sort of doing their bidding, much like Eve is. And so I really, you know, in telling ghost stories for a living, I take that very seriously, and that I'm not saying that flippantly. I really am interested in the voices of the past and what they still have to tell us. So I feel like I was able to weave some of my hopes and dreams for myself, for the world, into Summoning of Souls. There's a lot about that, this sort of the psychic energy that's happening there, and the found family narrative, and trying to look out for each other, trying to look out for New York City. You know, all of that's like very close to my heart. So I really put a lot of my direct hopes and dreams onto the page in that particular book, kind of unapologetically. And I was glad I could do that while still creating a very tight, very well-paced, very cleanly laid out book. So that's probably, I would sort of say, that book and that kind of book ends nicely. So one always wants to be honing and working on their craft as they go. And sometimes it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of moment. But for that one, I was like, nope, that one,
yeah,
that one hit the nail.
Well, good. And that's got to be a good feeling for you, that, you know, the feeling of satisfaction because of knowing, I mean, nobody knows better than you do how hard you worked on it. And, you know, to have someone else recognize that the result was what you were going for, that, you know, I'm sure that's got to be rewarding. Now, on the other hand, was there one of your books that was a particular struggle for whatever reason?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah, the first Eterna Files book, that was the hardest, and remains the hardest. And it is also my most poorly reviewed book because it ends on a cliffhanger. But I was told to do a cliffhanger by my editor. So, and I'm not absolving myself of responsibility, and I should have at least padded that cliffhanger with a little bit of knowing that the heroine isn't in complete danger, because it really just kind of cuts out midstream. Very cliffhanger. But I really had thought that it was going to be marketed a little bit in terms of the book one, that everyone knew that this was not the end of the series. I would never just literally cut out on a heroine in peril if I wasn't assured that the next book was coming. But so I think some folks just were not happy with that. And I learned my lesson and will never do that again.
Well, it's
So
a great
that's
book, I
that.
gotta say.
Well,
So
bless you and thank you. And I'm so glad that you say that. And it has, that series has a lot of fans, but like you have to get past that. You have to get past the cliffhanger. And by the time you get to Eterna Solution, that's really, really solid. But the trouble with the Eterna Files book 1 is that it's a very ambitious book, and I bit off a little more than I could chew, to be completely honest with you. And I should have pulled a little bit of book 2 into book 1 to tie the two separate London and New York offices together a little bit more quickly. And so if that gets a revised edition at some point, that's what I will be doing. I'm like, all right, let's bring this team together a little bit earlier. But you live and you learn. So
right. So even when you're done with the book, you're not really done with the book.
Oh, I'm never done with my book. Even when I'm doing readings, even when I'm doing readings for you at the Dragon Contracts, I'm editing as I go.
Oh, how about that? Okay. Well, now that we've gotten through the fiction, and I want to go to what you have the banner up behind you: A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. There we go. Okay. And that came out just recently. You did a reading of a very creepy and very cool story. I know it's not cool to you, it's just plain creepy, and it's very affecting.
I'm glad it was cool to you guys. It was it's harrowing to me, but that's all right. I'll do whatever it takes for entertainment.
Now, and so, yes, tell us about that book, and then, give everybody an idea of what it's about, which, again, I also give 2 thumbs up to. I really enjoyed it. And I'll tell you some of the things I most enjoyed about it.
Oh, thank you. I would love to know that. I would love to know that.
But some of that's because it's probably because of personal interest, but I mean, I enjoyed it very much. But I'm also curious about, for you, what was the challenge, or what were some of the challenges you faced of doing, nonfiction as opposed to fiction? And I know it's tied in with what your other job is as a tour guide, as a ghost tour guide. But anyway, go ahead and tell us about Haunted History.
Yeah, so A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts is a nonfiction book about ghost stories. Now, that in and of itself is almost a bit of a paradox sometimes, because when you are trying to uncover true ghost stories, you really have to go through a lot of hearsay and a lot of folk and urban legend, and oral histories are beautiful things, and so is folk history, and that's very, very valid. But sometimes folk history is built on things that were fabrications originally. But at a certain point, if you say something enough times, it does sort of become true. So we grapple with these things. We go through a history. It's not a comprehensive encyclopedia. It's not an encyclopedia of female ghosts of America. What it is it is a curated selection of women ghosts around this country. And we put them into different sections and tropes and stereotypes in terms of how they would have been sort of shunted into categories in life or in death. So we have a category on spinsters and widows, and why are we as a society afraid of women alone? We have a chapter on witches. We have a section on mad women. And I say these things in quotes because all of these things were aspersions cast on to these women. And so the book arose out of an editor taking one of my ghost tours in Manhattan and saying, I really like how you are presenting these stories. You're a great storyteller. She was aware of my fiction. You should write a ghost story book, a nonfiction about ghost stories. And I was like, okay, well, I work for a company called Burrows of the Dead. And my angle and my tack and my take on ghost stories in New York City is based on Andrea Jane's vision of this company, and she is the other name on this book. So when I was approached by an editor, I quickly said to the editor, I would be more comfortable with this if you'd be willing to entertain me bringing in my boss for this company, because it's a women-run company, and she has a lot of experience in why she's chosen to do what she does. And she had just created a Ghostly Women of Greenwich Village tour. She had just sort of focused in just on women's narratives in this one particular tour. And she got so much press out of that Bustle, NPR, the New York Times covered it. So all of this stuff, she was really interested in. She did this for Women's History Month, and she realized that there was this appetite for specifically talking about how do we talk about women ghosts and what do our difficulties with, being women through history, how does that factor into some of the restrictions maybe put onto their ghost stories? How do we unpack some of that? So it's part social history, women's studies. It's part history. We definitely start with history first. And speculation, we will tell you what is speculation, and we will tell you as many facts as we can get. And then if it's fuzzy, we will tell you it's fuzzy. And then you have to come up with your own conclusions as the reader, because we don't, much like as tour guides, ghost tour guides, we have had our own inexplicable experiences, but we don't tell you what to believe. We welcome skeptics, we welcome believers, and everything in between. We don't want to tell you what to think. What we want to tell you is, here are some facts, here are our opinions, and we have very strong opinions. We do not hold back about some things. You will get our opinions whether you like them or not. But that is, if you're going to be doing a book like this, you have to bring yourself to the project with your own worldview in hand. And I have a lot of thoughts as a ghost tour guide about what people seek when they're coming onto my tours. And I've told people that I ended up being a bit of a paranormal chaplain, where people would bring me their ghost stories like they were seeking a confessional. And I take that very seriously, and I hold that very dear, because these are intimate things. Very often at times of great crisis or great celebration in their lives, and something inexplicable is happening. And I don't take that any more lightly than I take the history. We cover some grim history in this. We start out with a Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, which I can't ever get through talking about without crying. And God help me if I ever do get through that without crying, because it should always be horrifying. It should always terrify us into trying to make sure we never take our labor laws for granted. So some of this book is a bit of a rallying cry to make sure that we don't repeat history again. And so it really is. It's been interesting to see reviews of this book, because a lot of people haven't really known exactly what they were getting into with this. They were thinking, oh, this is a book of ghost stories about women. Okay, all right. So these are all just women's ghost stories. Okay. But they weren't necessarily expecting some of the social unpacking that we do, like you would do in a social studies program, or, in a gender studies program. And they weren't necessarily expecting all the history in there and the backstory of these women before they were ghosts, and before their ghost stories were taken on to another level very often, or fabricated entirely. So it's fun because it's got a little bit of something for everyone, because we try to make it a range of history, commentary, and ghost story.
Well, and I think that you did a really good job with that, because the context is important. If people want to just read a good ghost story, that's fine. That's great. But what you guys set out to do was something completely different. And, I think the description of the book makes it very clear. So people shouldn't give you a hard time for it.
We hope so. But even so, you're never, when you're talking about, we are talking about some difficult subjects, and we are talking about, and this book should come with a bit of a content warning. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about ugly stuff. We're talking about death, murder, assaults, all of these things. It's really, and we're not, and unmanageable tragedies. But it's not all doom and gloom either. We've got some really funny ones in there too. Like there's a few characters in there that are kind of riots in life and in passing, who make their presence very known. So there's a lot of the most important thing we hope people will take away from this is that we really do love our subjects, and we come at this with love and with as much fact as we're able to. But even so, there's some things that we get wrong. We even know that, like we just saw a historian correct us on a date that got printed in wrong, and we were like, oh yeah, no, we know that's the correct date. I do not honestly know how in typesetting the book somebody inverted those numbers. So 1832, 1821, not sure how that happened, because we know 1832 is the correct one, but these things happen, and we just have to say, okay, for the reprint, let's make sure we get these in there for the reprint. And history is always changing too. But it is interesting because, we are in a time where women's rights are on the line, and some folks don't want to hear about it. And so, so you can You can look at the 1-star misleading feminist platform reviews, and it like, oh god, we want to be like, oh dude, we could have gone so much harder than we actually did. So like, if you thought this was bad, you should hear us unfiltered and unedited. So anyway,
That's right. That's right.
but
And not to
and you
mention,
just gotta laugh. You gotta laugh. It's like, what, you don't think we're gonna talk about women's issues in a book about
women
women?
ghosts.
We're just gonna only tell you a ghost story and then not extrapolate any on that. Okay, no, sorry. So yeah, so you're gonna get a little bit of context with your ghost story. So fair warning.
Yes, well, I think you guys did an excellent job, and I wanted to tell you that that I was really enjoyed reading the part about the Don Cesar Hotel,
Yes,
because I lived in Florida for many years, and when that place got reopened as a hotel, I kept thinking, oh, I want to go stay there someday, because it's this landmark on the
it
beach. You can
is.
see it from many different areas. I mean, in that specific area, you could be in different locations and see it well.
Yes.
And I kept thinking, oh, that's the coolest place. I need to go there sometime.
Yay, the
And
Pink Palace. Yeah, what a wild story of the creation of that.
yeah, and I had never heard that, even despite having lived there. So that was great. And I also really enjoyed the Winchester House
Thank you.
piece, because I actually, as a kid, lived in San Jose,
Did you?
and we never went.
You never went to San
Yeah, but we
Jose?
didn't live.
Oh
We
no.
didn't live there for maybe about a year, I guess. So
Okay.
that explains
It just
why.
gets
But
time gets away from you, but
yeah, and I
if you ever
remember,
make it out there.
I specifically remember driving with my parents. I was about 9 when we lived there. We were driving by in the car, and I remember seeing a sign that said something about Winchester House, but you could see the very top, like over the trees, yeah, or just like the very. And I was like, "What is that down there?" But I never got to go. So, and I've been there twice as an adult since then, and we have not done that. But I'll inform my husband that next time we go to California, we're definitely.
You got to do it. You got to do it. I traveled. Yeah. I specifically once this book was approved, I specifically booked a flight out to San Jose specifically to go to that house, because I knew when we were figuring out who was going to do what chapter, we knew that there were some things that were going to be passion projects for us. I knew Andrea was going to tackle the Lizzie Borden house, and I was like, have at that. That whole story creeps me out, and she did it beautifully, and I'm so impressed with her chapter. It's everyone on the team knew that Sarah Winchester is my girl, so I was gonna tackle the Winchester house, and so I knew some about her, but I didn't really I didn't know the deep dive that I tried to do with this chapter as best I could, as best as I was allowed in my word count limit. We were sort of given a try to make sure that your chapters don't go over 7,000 per chapter. So that one's kind of getting up there. So we had, that's one of my longest chapters, because I really want to get her history right, because history has so taken over her narrative and made it as something completely untrue. So, but yeah, so I did a lot of research and went out there, and the Winchester House staff is wonderful. And I met with Janin Boehm, who's the house historian. So it was a fairly new position, that she's the first house historian to really kind of work on separating some of the fact from fiction, and also looking at some of the parts of the house that are still in storage that were never necessarily put up or were taken down after the earthquake, and make sure that she's kind of attributing, okay, well, this would have been here, and sort of sorting out some of the history of the house and the pieces of the house that Sarah kept in storage, and trying to figure that out to this day, because there's still mysteries in the mystery house. So,
I'm sure.
But yeah, that was one of my definite favorite chapters to write.
Yes, and definitely a shout out to Andrea on the Lizzie Borden chapter. That was really well done too. That's because I think that's the story. She even says it in that chapter itself, that's everybody knows something about it. They may not know details, but when everybody knows the name, when you say
everyone,
after at least people of a certain age, once you get to be an adult, you've always heard that name. So, that was really an interesting one as well. And the whole thing is very good. And I hope you guys have great success with it, because it really is, you know, uh, I was going to say a lot of, well, parts of it are a lot of fun, but it was just very interesting. And some of it is, you know, it's horrifying because of the fact, not so much of the ghosts themselves, but of what created the ghosts. And I think that's what we all need to be thinking about anyway when it comes down to it, because
Absolutely.
that's what ends up happening in an actual ghost story, is
Mhm.
they're kind of trying to figure out, well, what, how, why are they here, what did they do,
Right.
so
Right. It is an ongoing, often a ghost story is an ongoing mystery. What's keeping them here? What's keeping them tethered? So we very much ask those questions of our subjects. And we really hope it does well, because we would love to do a volume 2.
Oh
And
wow, well,
that's
yeah.
because we have a structure now, and we would like to continue on with some of these categories and figure out how we could continue telling more stories, because there's a whole bunch of stories we wanted to do that we didn't have the space and the time to do for this volume. So we're really hoping to do a second volume. So hopefully this does well. And Kensington has been supporting this book very well. We have had a very good reception for it. So we hope that we can continue onward to tell more stories.
Well, I hope so too. And, that would be great. And you mentioned in the beginning the spinster section, and those were the ones that were, you know, in terms of I don't know if there's such a thing as a cozy ghost story, but some of those were a little more that
They
way.
are. They are. They're lovely. We're so attached to Gertrude Treadwell, specifically
Oh
in The
yeah,
Merchant's House, and that's definitely she's a fantastic ghost that's very, very active in that house. And a lot of this too is also, we're interested in historic preservation. These are house museums that, because of the ghost stories have helped preserve the house. They're a big attract for these historic districts, and so the commercial angle of that is not lost on us. I mean, we're in this industry, and
right,
yes, we do critique the industry. We critique we realize that we are in the industry, but what we do critique some of the industry for is not being sensitive. If you're sensitive
right,
about your subject matter, and if you try to sort of present the history and not sensationalize it, we're not interested in jump scares, and we're not interested in fabrication. So if you approach it with love and sensitivity and nuance, then we feel like you're doing right by the industry. If you're approaching it like you're trying to manufacture something, then that's where we raise eyebrows.
yes. And
And
you
if
have a
yeah,
good chapter about that topic, so yeah.
hmm hmm
So that's well done. So everybody, go get the book and the Ghost of the Forbidden and all of these. But what can we look for next from you? What's on your docket next that you can tell us about?
that I can tell you. So I've got a bunch of things with question marks in terms of the timing on them, but the thing that I know for certain is ongoing work with Scribed. So I have
Oh, good, good.
a dual timeline, steampunk and dystopian. So a steampunk historical and a futuristic dystopian dual timeline novella called "The World of Tomorrow is Sadly Outdated," that just went
Well,
through line edits, and that one is going to come out in early 2023. We don't have the date for that yet, because I still need to do the audio recording of the novella after I get back from book tour. So that's my next immediate project. So definitely be looking for future for both new work from me that's new as of this year and as of this summer from Scribed, and then also new work forthcoming. So yeah, I've been really enjoying doing some of these shorter pieces, and I also will have some pieces and some anthologies coming out as well. So stay tuned on all my social media for when those short stories and those anthologies will be coming around as well.
wonderful. Well, Leanna, thank you so much for having been here with me to answer all these questions.
Thank
It's
you.
been great, and I hope that the rest of your book tour goes well. And it's been lovely. It's always lovely to see you, and it feels like a special treat because typically it only gets to be at Dragon Con, and so this was an added time, and I appreciate that very much.
Oh,
So
I absolutely love talking with you. I really appreciate the support that you've given to me through the whole of my career. It's just been it's been so wonderful to share that with you, and that you really know the whole trajectory of it. It's been such a special thing to be able to take you with me on this journey. So thank you for all of that, and thanks for everyone tuning in. And I hope to see folks at the next Dragon Con, because I will certainly be.
yes,
I wouldn't
I
miss it for
hope
the world.
so. Well, thank you again, and we will hopefully, the Dragon Con, it's like when you go to the website and it tells you how many days until Dragon Con. I saw one, I thought, oh no, pretty soon it's going to be fewer than 300
I know.
days. I'm like, how did that happen? But thank you again, and good night, everyone. We appreciate you being here, and have a good October, everybody. Stay tuned. October 27th, Buffy Watch, which will be live, our discussion of season 2. Thank you.